we're going to combine 2 lessons into one. So for the first half, we're going to talk about aircraft documents regarding what you have to carry on board the aircraft, what maintenance is required, what inspections, things like that. And then the second half, we're going to get into weight and balance. So the importance of it, how to calculate it, and the different forms of calculating it. Also what to expect on the written test. So getting into manuals or aircraft documents, first one to look at are aircraft flight manuals. And there's a few different names that we'll talk about, but essentially these all contain essential information for the aircraft that you're flying. So think about it like the user manual that's inside the glove box in your car. Every aircraft has to have a manual on board that tells you all about the limitations, the systems, things like that. So this one's called airplane flight manuals, or AFMs. These are going to be specific to the serial number for the aircraft. So it comes with the plane and it'll have the serial number on the front of it. So you have to comply with the limitations in this book along with any manuals, markings, or placards that are on the aircraft. So sometimes you'll see things printed off all across the aircraft or placards that are outside. So just little metal plaques on the tail surface or on different control surfaces, and you have to comply with those. Another one is a POH, that's a pilot's operating handbook. So although the name is different, this contains the AFM information within it. So you'll see on the cover of some of these, it'll have the serial number, and underneath a message will say, this handbook includes the material required to be furnished to the pilot and constitutes the FAA-approved airplane flight manual. So even though it says pilot's operating handbook, it'll also say and AFM underneath it. Another one you'll come across is a pilot information manual, or PIM. So you see at the top of this one, it just says information manual. It does not say POH on it. And then the message underneath here is pretty similar to one we just looked at. It's going to say incorporates information issued in the POH and AFM. So difference with this is these can be distributed, or you can get a copy of an information manual, and it's going to be generic to any Cessna model or SP model in this case. Generally, it's going to include the model, so 172S, optional equipment, and a range of serial numbers. So if the aircraft that you're flying falls within that range of serial numbers, you can use this manual to study and learn more about your aircraft. So usually anytime you purchase one from like a supply store, or if you download a PDF of a POH, it's considered a PIM, information manual. Most of the time though, people don't differentiate with names, they just say POH. So regardless of what type of manual they're talking about, they'll generally just say POH. People often ask, what is the difference? There's no difference, they all contain the same information really. Contents are going to be the same of a flight manual or POH, and this is going to be the same across most, if not all, aircraft that you fly. Is the organization or the layout of the POH is going to be exactly the same, so you'll know where to find the information if you're flying a new plane. We'll get into all these individually, but section 1 is general information about the airplane, so it's going to be like dimensions, wingspan, propeller length, things like that. Limitations, emergency procedures, normal procedures, performance, weight and balance, systems descriptions, handling and service, and then any supplemental information. So supplemental information is usually going to be additional equipment in the aircraft. So if you have something like autopilot, there's going to be additional information about your autopilot in section 7. Looking at all these sections individually, again, general information is going to be like dimensions of the aircraft, ground clearance, turn radius, things like that. And limitations, so it's going to include like weight limitations as well as airspeed limitations and ranges. Emergency procedures, this will often be organized depending on what type of emergency or failure you encounter, followed by the essential steps to follow if you encounter that. So the checklist that you use for flying is usually pulled out of these sections. So on your checklist, there's an emergency section, and all of those steps are going to be pulled from the POH because obviously the manufacturer is going to be the primary source for this kind of information. Really common question. People get kind of overwhelmed looking at this stuff and they see all of these checklist items and they get kind of worried, do I have to memorize every single one of these steps? No, Cessna recommends just memorizing the bold numbers and then following the appropriate checklist afterwards. So it's a little more manageable. You'll become so familiar that you almost memorize it. You're going to have all the steps pretty much memorized, if not just have a flow pattern. But you are required to use a checklist of some sort. So if you have your own laminated checklist, or if you use the paper checklist that we provide here, when you go to do your practical test, you're going to be required to use a checklist. You don't have to memorize a checklist. So hopefully that relieves some stress for you guys. Most of the time, though, people do develop a flow pattern, and so they will perform a checklist and then verify using an actual checklist that it's completed. Same idea with section 4, normal procedures. So something like normal takeoff, short field takeoff, or en route climb, all of the steps and recommended airspeeds and things like that are provided in this section. And just like emergencies, you don't need to memorize all of this. Use the checklist, especially as you're learning. Use the checklist. People are very excited when they first start going through training and learning and stuff, and they end up skipping steps. Or really common is that they think they have it memorized, so they put the checklist in their pocket, and then they end up skipping some essential steps as they're doing the pre-flight. So just use it. Performance section. So as you learn to do cross-country planning, you'll use section 5 to do certain calculations. So how long is it going to take you to get somewhere based off of your speed? How much fuel are you going to burn? How long it's going to take you. And section 6, which we'll look at a little bit today, is weight and balance and equipment list. So you'd reference this section to calculate weight and balance. And there's also a part of this section that'll tell you how to calculate, so how to weigh the aircraft itself. Not that any student or pilot really is going out there and weighing their aircraft, but if you're the owner, it kind of lays out how you do that. Section 7 is all about your systems. So really specific details about the electrical system in your aircraft, the fuel system, the air vents, anything you could think of. I've mentioned before, a really common weak point for most students and applicants to go get your license is systems. Partly because, at least in our syllabus, this is recommended early in your training. Hey, lesson 1, go read the entire section 7 of your flight manual. And like to a new student, that doesn't mean anything. You haven't really flown much. That doesn't carry a lot of weight. And so it's definitely a topic and section you're going to have to go back to continuously. And every time you go back to it, you're going to learn something new. I've been doing this for a while, and I still read section 7, and I learn something new about the system, or refresh if I've forgotten something. Section 8, handling, service, and maintenance. And 9, like I mentioned before, is supplemental section. So additional equipment like autopilot, navigation system, like G1000. So here's a list of required documents that must be carried in the aircraft. Easy way to remember this is ARROW, A-R-R-O-W. So most checklists will have these items on it, and it'll say Aero. And so when you first start your pre-flight, you're making sure that all these documents are in the aircraft. The first one is Airworthiness certificate. So that, along with your registration, have to be viewable to passengers. So usually it'll be on the pilot side, the left side, in the side pockets. It's gonna be like a little transparent pocket for it. And registration certificate. Next is radio license, and that's only if you're operating outside the US. You apply for this through FCC. Obviously for flight training and flying in the US, you do not need this. Next is O. Sometimes people will memorize this as operating handbook, like POH. Specifically, it's operating limitations, which can be found in the AFM or POH. So as long as your POH is in the back seat or on board the aircraft, you're okay. As long as section 2 of that POH has not been removed, you're okay. So double check. Updated weight and balance data. And additional ones on top of the Aero checklist is compass deviation card. So you're required to have a compass on board, and you also need the deviation card along with that compass. And external data plate or serial number. A little bit more about the Airworthiness certificate. So it's kind of a few different parts to it. First is going to be the nationality of the aircraft, which sounds kind of funny, but where is that aircraft registered? You'll see that most tail numbers start with an N. That just means it's a US registered aircraft. Generally, you don't have to say N when you're repeating your tail number. Some people do, some controllers will as well, but most of the time it's just implied. Part number 2 is the manufacturer and model, serial number, category. So we talked last time during the review about category and class. So the category is going to be normal in this case. Then authority, when it was issued, who is the representative. So an important point is what's highlighted at the bottom is that your airworthiness certificate does not expire. So it'll remain valid as long as the aircraft meets its approved type design, is in a condition for safe operation, and maintenance, preventive maintenance, and alterations are performed in accordance to the regulations. So as long as it meets its approved type design and it's in an airworthy condition, this certificate will remain valid. You can get a special airworthiness certificate. It's going to include aircraft that are categorized as experimental, restricted, limited, provisional, or light sport. And your registration certificate, just like your car registration, this one does expire. It used to be 3 years, and it's recently been updated to 7 years. It's really common doing pre-flight for, I guess, everyone, pilots, student pilots, is that they'll see that it's in the side pocket, but they won't look at it, if that makes sense. They'll see that it's present, but they're not going to actually look at it. So it's a really good habit to pull those out of the side pocket and verify the date on the registration. Make sure it's good, and it'll have an expiration at the bottom. If you're purchasing a new aircraft, they have a registration, a dealer's registration on the aircraft. Once you purchase it, you need to apply for your own registration, or ideally you'd have this completed before purchasing the aircraft. But you can't fly it on the dealer's registration. All right, here's a fun one. So this is a table of required maintenance or inspections on your aircraft. Most common way to remember this is aviate. Instead of an I, it's a 1, and we'll talk about what that means. So going down the list, an annual inspection is required annually, every 12 calendar months. So most maintenance or inspections can be done by a mechanic, airframe and power plant mechanic, A&P. However, an annual inspection must be done by an A&P that also holds something called an IA, Inspection Authority. Something called Airworthiness directives. Those are going to be as required. So airworthiness directives are distributed as necessary. If a specific component needs to be inspected due to issues or like failure, the FAA will send out, hey, you need to inspect the air filter on a Cessna 172 every 500 hours, or else it's known to fail. VOR inspection, that's required every 30 days if using the VOR for IFR flight. So, although not required for VFR flight, still a good idea to test your VOR, especially if you're going to be relying on it during a cross-country flight. You want to make sure it's accurate. And at some point, we'll talk about the different ways to test that. You can do this yourself. This doesn't have to be done by a mechanic. There's ways in the aircraft to test the VOR to make sure it's accurate. A 100-hour inspection, every 100 hours. So that's where that one comes from. So this is only if for hire or if the aircraft is used for instruction. If it's your personal airplane, you don't need to do the 100-hour inspection, just annual. An important note about the 100-hour is that you can legally overfly the 100 hours if you're en route somewhere that the maintenance is going to be performed. You're allowed to overfly it by up to 10 hours. And so if you're en route somewhere and it clock ticks over to 102 hours, it's still legal as long as you're en route somewhere where you're going to have that done. If you do exceed the 100 hours though, it's going to be deducted from the next 100 hour, so it's not kind of like rollover minutes. So let's say an inspection is due at 500 hours. You exceeded it by 2 hours, so now you're at 502. The next inspection is still going to be due at 600 hours, not 602, if that makes sense. So it's just deducted from the next 100 hour. Oftentimes the 100-hour and annual inspection will be scheduled together because it just makes sense to get them done. You don't want to do the annual and then in 2 weeks have to do the 100-hour or something, so they usually will combine them. The next two categories, altimeter, pitot-static inspection, and transponder, are every 24 calendar months, 2 years. The altimeter pitot-static inspection is only going to be required in controlled airspace under IFR. Again, doesn't necessarily apply to you as a VFR pilot, but why not verify that these have been completed? And lastly, ELT transmitter, and there's going to be two parts to this one, a replacement and an inspection. So the battery is going to be required to be replaced after 1 hour of cumulative use or 50% of its useful life. So just like any device that you have, batteries begin to degrade over time. So once an ELT battery loses 50% of its useful life, it needs to be replaced. And it needs to be inspected every 12 calendar months. All right, preventive maintenance. Apparently, you can say this word two ways. You can say preventive or preventative. I always feel like I was saying it wrong. So preventive maintenance, that's going to be section 43 of regulations. So as a pilot and owner of the aircraft, you are allowed to do what's called preventative maintenance. And there's a list of examples, and it's kind of limited to what you're allowed to do. Basically anything that doesn't require disassembly. So an example would be removal, installation, or repair of landing gear tires. Service landing gear shock struts by adding oil, air, or both. servicing landing gear wheel bearings such as cleaning, greasing, replacing defective safety wiring or cotter keys. Lubrication, not requiring disassembly other than removal of non-structural items such as cover plates, cowlings, and fairings. So you can top off the oil, but if it requires disassembly of any sort, you're not allowed to do it. And if you do perform preventive maintenance, you have to log it in the aircraft maintenance logbook. Description of the maintenance you performed, the date you did it, your name, your certificate number, and your type of certificate. So 91205 lists out all the required equipment for day VFR. Not all of these apply to you, but a really common way that people memorize this is eight tomato flames, because it's so ridiculous it kind of helps to memorize it. So usually it's going to be equipment or gauges or instruments. So airspeed indicator is going to be required. Tachometer for each engine. So if you have a multi-engine aircraft, you have to have a tachometer for each one. Oil pressure gauge for each engine. Manifold pressure gauge for each engine. So manifold pressure is going to be on constant speed propellers. It does not apply to you with a fixed pitch propeller. Altimeter, temperature gauge for each liquid cooled engine. Again, we have an air cooled engine, so this one does not apply. Oil temperature gauge, fuel gauge, flotation gear if you're operating for higher over water beyond a gliding distance back to the runway, or back to basically the shoreline. So what that means is if you're for hire, you can't go over the water, or let's say fly to Catalina, without carrying flotation gear, so like a life jacket or something. So anytime you go beyond a distance where you can't safely glide back to the land, then you need to have a flotation gear. For retractable landing gear, you need a landing gear position indicator, anti-collision lights. So anti-collision lights will be strobes, and those are also going to be a beacon. Magnetic compass, and like we looked at before with the aero checklist, compass deviation card as well. ELT also required, and safety belts. So again, that's for day VFR. There's additional items for night that we'll look at. So for night flight, you're required to have everything that we just talked about, as well as flaps. So flap stands for fuses, landing light, anti-collision light, position light, and a source of electrical energy. So fuses, we do not use fuses anymore. We have circuit breakers, because fuses, once they're popped, you have to replace it with one that's not burnt out. So in the case of those aircraft, you'd have to carry additional fuses with you. For a circuit breaker, you can pop it back in. Landing light, if for hire. Anti-collision lights, that's just repeated again. Position lights. So position lights are also called nav lights, are going to be the red light that's on the left wing, the green light on the right, and then the white light on the tail. And a source of electrical energy. So generator, alternator, battery. You need something to turn on the lights and radio equipment. We usually keep all lights on during flying just because it helps keep you visible. Really, it's like running the daytime lights in your car. It makes you more visible, especially at night. So in addition to the regulations, most aircraft will have a kinds of operations equipment list, or KOEL. So this will be in the POH, and it lists what items are required for different conditions. So day VFR, night VFR, day IFR, night IFR. So usually if it has a 1 next to it, it's required. If it has a 0, it's not required. So in the case of this aircraft, you have a main and a standby battery. The main battery is required, alternator is required, but a standby battery is not required. And a little bit more about airworthiness directives. So these are just used to notify owners or people that are using the aircraft of potentially unsafe conditions. So it is the responsibility of the owner or operator to ensure compliance. So a really common test question is this question exactly, and most people get tripped up because sometimes the wording can change on the question. It'll ask you, whose responsibility is it to comply with airworthiness directives? Falls under the owner or operator. And a question very similar that people get confused about is it'll say, whose responsibility is it to ensure the aircraft is airworthy, in an airworthy condition for that flight or something, which would be the pilot command. So maintenance and kind of the general upkeep is going to be on the owner or operator, but then ensuring that the plane is safe to go fly is up to the pilot command, because you're required to do the inspection and the final call. Those will fall under two categories: those requiring immediate compliance and less urgent ones that can also be recurring. So recurring is every few hundred hours something needs to be inspected or replaced, and it's just continuous. Once you reach 300 hours, replace this item, and it just continues. Immediate compliance is usually just a one-time fix. So these are regulatory, meaning if you have not complied with airworthiness directives, the plane is not airworthy, so you can't go fly. (91.213) lists out inoperative equipment, and this is kind of a handy flow chart about making a decision to go fly. So if you go pre-flight the aircraft and you notice that something is not working, this is kind of a good mental process to follow to see if you're safe to go fly. So step number one, right here in this red square, something is broken. Your first thought is, does your aircraft have an MEL, minimum equipment list? I'll tell you your answer is no. So minimum equipment list is usually going to be commercial aircraft that have an approved list of items that are required to go fly. However, small aircraft don't have that. So no, that means you can skip right along. Otherwise, you would just follow the MEL. Is it required by Day VFR type certificate? No. Is it required by the kinds of operation equipment list? So that was the KOEL that we looked at, provided by the manufacturer. If it's not on there, is it required by 91.205, which was atomato flames or flaps? So if it's not listed on either of those, is it required by an airworthiness directive? If the answer is no, you have to remove, deactivate, or placard that aircraft as inoperative. It should say and instead of or, so deactivate and placard it as inoperative. Anyone that's done flight training so far may have noticed a few things that may say inoperative. Sometimes it's like autopilot, which is absolutely not necessary. And so it'll say inoperative, and so that component has been deactivated, meaning it's disconnected from the system, and it's also labeled or placarded. So can you determine that the flight can be completed safely? Or you can also ask a mechanic if it's safe to continue the flight. And if you both decide yes, you can go fly. If not, don't fly. So a common mistake with this one is that people memorize something like atomato flames, and if it doesn't meet that requirement, then they're like, yeah, it's not on there, I can go fly. And so they're not familiar with the other sources of required equipment. So just want to be familiar with all of these. There's something called a special flight permit or ferry permit. If your aircraft is in an unairworthy condition and you need to fly to another airport where maintenance can be performed, you can request this permit from something called FSDO, FSDO. That stands for Flight Standards District Office. You would request this permit or certificate from them, and they would approve you to fly an otherwise unairworthy aircraft. So these offices are everywhere. Our closest FSDO is Long Beach, and so Long Beach is kind of in charge of this whole region. As far as like safety and like special flight permits and like training requirements and things like that. So like FSDO will come over to our flight school sometimes, and like if we're trying to meet a different requirement for, like, example would be this class, like we got 141 approved, so the FSDO had to come out and inspect the class and look at the curriculum and things like that.